Yes, hello. Gloomy topic, prisons. But I'm very happy to be here today and talk about a book that came out last year with MIT Press. And the book really was a passion project. We never received funding for it, and I wrote it together with my colleague Frederick, who can't be here today. But at some point, after applying a couple of times for funding, we decided this book needs to be written anyway, although nobody really wants to pay for it. So for over 7 years, we did archival work, we did field visits at prisons in Sweden mainly, but also in the US, and we did some patent research. And this is what came out of it. This is how the book looks like. I just got the royalty statement last week for the whole last year. You don't get rich writing books about prisons, I can tell you. But you can download it for free, actually. So MIT is generously funding the open access to the book. Maybe it helps to keep it open access to click a couple of times, so please go in and download it. So why did we think 7 years ago there needs to be a book about prison media? I mean, prison media, it's not really a thing. When you Google it, there's not a product that you can buy that's called prison media. But we thought, it's also a concept that I'm going to introduce in a second, but we had two main entry points into the field of prisons in connection with media. And one was more metaphorical one. People started talking about being incarcerated by their social media, by the data that we are producing ourselves, by how we are surveying ourselves, by quantifying our practices, our relationships, whatever we do. So the data prison emerged as a kind of way to discuss these practices of quantifying ourselves in digital media platforms. And for example, the German journalist Adrian Lobe uses this metaphor to talk about social media culture and digital platforms. But there was also the media theorist Andreas Bernhard, who started to think about the origin of the profile in social media and traces it back into criminology and psychiatrics, how we've been profiling people and ourselves as well. So it's this kind of discursive move towards thinking about digital practices in terms of data prisons. But there was also this very material move towards the smart prison. So smart technologies were introduced in the prison context. So the actual smart prison was about to emerge. And for example, in Hong Kong, there were projects around the prisons without guards, so that smart technology would take over surveillance and control of incarcerated, and guards would rather work with rehabilitation and therapeutical approaches. So this was also kind of something we were seeing, the actual introduction of digital media in the prison context. So everything from AI-powered CCTV surveillance, but also Fitbits to kind of predict if an incarcerated person is feeling differently, is in panic, or is in a hyper-alerted mode, for example, or is in danger to commit suicide, for example, to kind of measure the body activities. So in different ways, these two ways of thinking about the connection between digital and data and the prison also reflect how prisons have been talked about theoretically. I don't want to go too much into theory, but some names you always have to name when you talk about prisons is, of course, Michel Foucault and Erving Goffman. And the way thinking of the connection between the digital and the prison, as I introduced just now, these two kind of lenses also reflect how these two theorists have thought about the prison. So on the one hand, we have Foucault thinking of the prison and punishment being dispersed in society. It's also something of self-technologies and self-control. We are kind of thinking the panopticon, ourselves being surveyed and adjusting our practices accordingly. And the smart prison as something that's completely secluded from the social world, something that is completely different, could feature this kind of Goffmanian way of thinking about the prison, the total institution, where we have to learn new practices, where names are removed and exchanged with numbers instead of names, and your identity is completely redone, but also new kinds of practices are emerging within the prison context. So on the one hand, the way of thinking punishment and surveillance is dispersed and kind of internalized in society, and on the other hand, this kind of total institution that constitutes something completely different from what we otherwise know. So these were the entry points for us to kind of think about how do media and prisons come together. And this is why we developed this idea of prison media after engaging with the first empirical stuff that we've been looking at. And we started actually in the archives, where we saw the first connection between prisons and media emerging in order books. Who was buying prison labor in Swedish prison context in the 70s? These were media companies and technology companies. It was the postal system, it was Telia, which is now Telia, it was back then Televerket, which was state-owned, and it was Ericsson, who were ordering components from prison labor, from the big industrial prisons. And this is when we started to think, okay, we need some kind of theoretic conceptual notion of bringing media and prison together. So we think about this as prison media. And here we think about media that are produced in prison, as I just mentioned, like the components, the bits and pieces that are produced by incarcerated. We are also thinking about smart technology that is developed for prisons, that is tested in prisons, and this is something I'm going to zoom in on later. But we also think of the prison as a medium in itself, the architecture that is constraining but also facilitating communication. And this is what we write about in the book in the 3 analytical chapters. We write about prison media work, we write about prison media architecture, and we write about prison media development. So just briefly about the 3 areas or tropes, and then I'm going to zoom in to this kind of test bedding of technology in the prison context. So I mentioned already one example of media work that we first encountered in our archival work, which was this kind of small component work in the industrial prison of the 1960s and 70s in Sweden. And I mentioned some of the orders that were placed in the Swedish prison context, but we still see this kind of prison labor today. And this ranges from call center work in US prisons, for example, where people might be calling into a prison context, but also data work, annotation work that has been used in Finnish prisons. This never was a super scaled up project in the Finnish context where data annotators were female incarcerated. It was rather a pilot, and the startup company also, after only a year, kind of withdrew the collaboration, but the Finnish prison and probation services were very keen on keeping this kind of cutting-edge AI work in the prison context, also being able to present this kind of innovative way of engaging incarcerated in the prison context, working on AI. This was, of course, a very simplified work. It was basically categorizing images and assigning Finnish labels to it. And Finnish is a small language, so Amazon Mechanical Turk wasn't an option for this kind of click work. So they turned to the prison context to kind of find cheap labor. So these are just some examples that we are engaging with in the book. And as I said, we also think about the prison as a medium in itself, namely the architecture. And if we think of how the first modern prison at the end of the 19th century was organized, it was thought of as a silent system. Incarcerated were supposed to go in themselves and understand their wrongdoings by being silent most of the day. So the prison architecture also reflects this idea of punishment through silence. So we have secluded spaces, there are no open areas for meeting or conversation and so on. And with each and every prison reform, new ways of thinking about punishment were also introduced, and this is featuring in the architecture. So in the book, we are tracing these developments over time and also look into the 1950s when the idea of communication really became central in the Swedish context. And this kind of communal area became an important point, meeting point, to allow and facilitate communication between incarcerated, but also with wardens and staff in the prison context. And it was the idea of rehabilitation that was very important, and communication was an important part of it. But here I have a picture from one of the largest prisons in Sweden, which is Kumla, where we see an intersection between technology and prison architecture. So most of the large industrial prisons in Sweden, which house around 500 up to 800 incarcerated at the time, they are connected to different housing blocks through a tunnel system. And the tunnel system was only made possible through CCTV surveillance, so that also the movement between the different areas of the prison could be automated and made more efficient without using a lot of staff moving incarcerated. So there's this kind of connection between technology and architecture as well. And this is what we explore in the second chapter of the book. But as I said, I'm going to focus on prison media development, or this idea of test-bedding technology in the prison context. And then also how technologies that were first imagined and developed in the correctional context for punishment, for control, for surveillance, are dispersed into other areas of society. But I want to say a couple of words about what we've actually been doing. So the material that we are basing the analysis in the 3 chapters upon, as I said, we've mainly been working with archival materials from the Swedish Prison and Probation Services. We made public records requests to get also information about the current orders of the prison sector. We have made field visits. We visited 3 high-security prisons in Sweden, but also in the US, and made observations at prison technology fairs, where the latest technology is kind of performed, these kind of theaters of technology. But we also had some interview material, tried to access the prison and engage with incarcerated perspectives as well, which was a bit difficult to say the least. We really tried. But instead, we had access to interview material that was conducted in 2014, which is about the working conditions and how incarcerated are experiencing the work in the prison context. So we had access to the transcripts. But we also did an analysis of patents for ankle monitors, which I'm going to discuss in a second. So in this chapter on prison media development or technology development, we also kind of go back to Foucault, who already said the prison could be thought of as a laboratory, where tests can be made for medication, for technologies, surveillance technologies, and so on, because it's kind of outside of certain regulations that otherwise apply. And Andreas Bernhard, that I mentioned in the beginning, who uses this kind of way of thinking about the data prison and tracing genealogy back to the profile in criminology and psychiatry of social media today, is kind of this discursive way of connecting digital media and the prison. But we wanted to actually trace the material connection between media development and the prison context. And we have one example of the first high-security, high-tech prison in Sweden, and it's at the same time the first large-scale use of CCTV in the Swedish context, which is a prison that was opened in 1956, which is just north of Stockholm, which was the first to kind of have this camera surveillance and also radio connection between guards, for example. And from there, it, of course, spread to other areas of society. So then we took one example and wanted to really trace the connection between media technologies that were tested in the prison context and then moved into other areas of society. So we were thinking how to do it, and we used the ankle monitor, because it's also a nice illustration of how the character of the prison today is changing, because it's more and more dispersed. It's kind of the removal of the prison as an architectural structure. The prison is moving into the homes of the people instead. So we have a lot of small prisons, individualized prisons in society instead. But in the Swedish context, this kind of dream of taking the prison home was already actualized in the early 1990s, where we, as today, had a discourse on tough on crime, we had a change in penal law, and there were a huge number of incoming incarcerated that couldn't be taken care of in all the facilities. So there was a lack of places, and it's exactly the same situation at the moment. So there are too few prison places. So the idea was, again, this kind of, the technology will solve this challenge of not being able to incarcerate enough. So ankle monitoring was imported into the Swedish context, and the first tests were made in the early 90s in a number of cities, pilot cities, to work with ankle monitoring. And the Swedish press was rather positive. I mean, there were a couple of critical articles about this process of introducing ankle monitoring, and some of the journalists kind of jokingly called it the electronic leash. But we thought it's maybe a good way to start there, and we went back to some of the initial patents for ankle monitoring that already emerged in the mid-1960s in the US context. And there are also some kind of popular culture connections who first imagined the ankle monitoring as a possible solution and so on. There's also a nice story in Andreas Bernhard's book about this. But we wanted to see, okay, who is actually basing technology today on those first initial developments of ankle monitoring. So we went to one of the original patents from the 1960s, and like academic papers, some of you might know, there are also these kind of citations. So technologies that are patented in the US context, they refer back to previous technologies, like academic papers are referring to previous work, previous research. So we were going through the patents that are citing those initial ankle monitoring patents. And what kind of technologies did we see? Yes, of course, it's the health-related wellness applications of Fitbits and smartwatches that are dominating the citations referring back to those initial ankle monitorings. But we also see workplace surveillance technologies and tracking technologies of children and animals in this context, and other related tracking technologies, for example, tracking the location of callers, for example. We also see technologies or technology providers that were buying and ordering technologies from the Swedish prisons in the 70s, citing back those ankle monitoring systems like Ericsson again. So it's kind of emerging in both the prison labor-related materials that we have seen and in the patents that we are citing. And through this analysis of patent citings, we really wanted to trace how technologies that are test-bedded, that are developed for a correctional purpose, are then moving into other areas, where we ourselves choose to track and maybe survey and constrain our behaviors, or at least adjust them accordingly, and making this material connections, technological connections visible. But then, to conclude, as I try to show through the examples that I've mentioned and the way in which we define prison media, we think of them as materials, we think of them as specific devices and technologies, but they are also very much imaginaries. They are ideas about control and punishment, and they are symbols as well as practices. And in many ways, prison media are entangled with very general questions of sociality, of how we are coming together, but also how we are separated from each other, like the prison itself, kind of separating the good from the bad. And in a similar way, prison media are reflecting these distinctions how social worlds are connected and disconnected from each other. And prison media are, of course, a way or part of punishment, of surveillance, of control. But of course, media also might be a way to reimagine how societies are coming together. So it has this kind of ambiguous points as well. And in the book, we have some examples of prison media that are produced by incarcerated, for example, by themselves, and where they're trying to reimagine what the prison might be and should be in the future. So it also has this kind of utopian or potential for change. Prison media doesn't only focus on control and surveillance, but we think, if we want to think about technologies as technologies of freedom that allow us to connect, like digital media were or social media were promising us at some point, we also have to think about the connections to incarceration, to unfreedom, to control, to surveillance, that are very, very material and not only symbolic and metaphorical. And that is very much what we are trying to say in the book, and I hope that you download it, enjoy it, and read it, and reach out if you have any feedback. And I think we have maybe a time for one question before the change and the next speaker, if there are any questions. I don't know if there's a microphone, maybe. There's one question in the back or in the middle.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. Considering that the topic of this year's conference is care work, I was wondering how it is in Sweden with the connection between care by family members towards incarcerated people and the people that are inside. Like in the US, you have a lot of telecommunications technology, which is set to use, for example, voices of family members to train certain softwares, stuff like that. So I was wondering how that is for the Swedish context.
Yeah, thank you so much. So this is one aspect where prisons are notoriously bad, or the Swedish system at least, the access to digital technology. So most of the prisoners or incarcerated don't have access to either laptops or, of course, not internet connection at all. They can use laptops for studying purposes under surveillance by staff, but it's really this kind of access and enabling of connection through digital is not really a given. I mean, COVID changed a lot. There are video calls made possible in a very speed-up way, but the educational and kind of training side of allowing digital technologies in the prison context is not comparing it to the control and punishment part. It's a minor aspect. I think one more, yeah.
Thank you. Really interesting. Okay. I was wondering, because you looked at archives of conversations about this, I was wondering how people talk about these experiments that they have in prison. Do they think about it as experimenting on the prisoners, or are they just kind of developing their own technology and thinking about it? Like, do they think that it's an opportunity for like test subjects, basically?
Yeah. I mean, the funny thing is that you would think that they don't present it as test bedding or as experimental sites or whatever. But because most of the people who engage in that kind of technology startup scene and then are brought into the prison context, they come with this language of test bedding and so on. So they brought it in, and the prison and probation services, they totally bought it. So the Public Agency for Innovation, they funded several projects for radical innovation, test bedding, smart technologies in prisons. Yes, they use this language. Okay, I think I should leave to make the transition to the next speaker. Yeah? Thank you so much for coming.